Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so I guess we will get started now. Um, so, welcome to part four of five of From the Mishnah to Magid. In the previous class, we talked about how we tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt in the Haggadah, and explored why it seems so disorganized and confusing and doesn't really tell a full version of the story. This class, I'd like to interrogate what you might say is a related question, which is why do we tell the story at all? And as I say in my title, why isn't the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, more of a focus, even though we can't bring it anymore? Why is talking about it not more of a focus of what we do at the Seder and in the Haggadah? And by way of exploring this question, we will also get into related topics, such as discussions about the future redemption or the Messianic era and how that it's also makes its way into the Pesach Seder and into the Haggadah. So at one time, when the temple was standing, so much of the holiday of Pesach was about offering the Korban Pesach, about eating the Korban Pesach. The Mishnah in Pesachim is much of it discusses those halachos related to how you do the Korban. Much of the Gemara does as well. Of course, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there was a rupture. And this is true in so many aspects of our religion. So much of what we did and what Judaism was centered around ceased to be the case. Chazal, our sages who lived in that time, had to figure out how is it that we reconstruct Judaism? How is it that we make meaning out of our religion that was so centered around the Beis Hamikdash, so centered around the sacrificial order, and now that it's gone, what is it that we do? What is it that we focus on? And one of the things they had to figure out how to reconstruct in the absence of the temple was Pesach, and was the night of Pesach in particular. With that introduction, let me share you my source sheet and we'll look at some sources that might shed some light on this issue.
Could you just repeat that quickly? Because I came in 2 minutes late because I had a Zoom.
I mean, all that I said so far is that once when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, the night of Pesach was focused very much around sacrificing and then eating the Korban Pesach. Once there is no more Korban Pesach, then Chazal had to figure out how and on what axis to reconstruct Pesach. So we're going to look at some sources. We're going to look at some sources on that now. So if you look in source number one, this is a short piece from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's Haggadah, and I really like the way he frames this issue. So I like to quote it, and I'll read you just the first half of this source in source number one. And he says, this is talking about after the destruction of the temple. What happened next is one of the great, if quiet, dramas of history. The Jewish people, so bound to time and space, seeing God in history and its home in a specific land, reconstituted itself as a nation outside time and space. Prayer took the place of sacrifice, and that's going to be important for our topic here. The study of Torah replaced prophecy. Repentance became a substitute for the great ritual of atonement performed by the high priest in the Holy of Holies. The synagogue, a building that could be anywhere, became a fragment of the temple in Jerusalem. So we'll stop here for now. But I think for our purposes in particular, prayer took the place of sacrifice is central. So, and this is definitely true, for example, on Yom Kippur, where we can no longer do the Yom Kippur ritual that the Kohen Gadol did in the Beis Hamikdash. So instead, we have a lot of prayer. If we look at some additional sources, there's a well-known pasuk in Hosea, which I have here in source number two, about the role of prayer as substituting for sacrifice. So the Navi says, "Kechu imachem dvarim," take with words with you, "V'shuva el Hashem," return to God, "Imru elav," say to Him, "Kol tisa avon v'kach tov," forgive all guilt and accept what is good, "U'neshama farim sefasenu." Instead of bulls, we will pay the offering of our lips. So you probably heard this phrase before, "Neshama farim sefasenu," that instead of the sacrificial order, we repent, we pray. Now, when we pray, according to the Gemara, it's more than just a substitute such that, we're doing something different. But it's that particularly there's a particular emphasis placed on not just prayer, but on reciting psukim, verses about the sacrifices. And if you look in the Gemara in Tanis here in source number 3, this is a Gemara where about Avraham Avinu at the bris bein Abasarim, at the covenant between the parts, and his conversation with Hashem about how he can know that his children will indeed be redeemed in the future. And Avram says, Amar Lefanav, he says to Hashem, Ribono Sha'olam, Master of the world, Tinach Bizman Shebeis HaMikdash Kayam. This is fine when the Beis HaMikdash is standing. Bizman She'ein Beis HaMikdash Kayam Ma'atei Alehem. When they don't have the sacrifices in the temple, what will be with them? What will be with the Jewish people? Amar Lo Hashem said to him, Kavar Tikanti Lehem Seder Karbanos. I have already enacted the order of the offerings. Bizman Shekorin Behen Lefanai. Once they read them and before me, Mala Ani Alehem Ki'ilu Hikrivum. Then I will consider as if they sacrifice them lefanai before me, v'ani mocha lahem al kol avonosehem, and I will forgive all their sins. So this is saying something very interesting. That it's not just in a more amorphous way that prayer substitutes for sacrifice, but that what part of what we should be doing when we pray is actually reciting the verses about the sacrifices themselves, and that itself gives some kind of atonement. If you look further in source number 4 in the Gemara Menachos, it says something similar. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, my dixiv, what is this pasuk? Torah, Zos Torah Sachatas, V'Zos Torah Sa'asham. What does it say? This is the order of bringing the sin offering. This is the order of bringing the guilt offering. What does it mean that it's the order of, or the law of the Torah, the law of? Kola Osek B'Torah Schata. So when you learn about the laws of the chatas, ki'ilu hikriv chatas. It's as if you brought the sin offering. V'chola osek b'toras asham, anyone who studies the laws of the guilt offering, ki'ilu hikriv asham, it's as if he brought one. So there's a very strong emphasis in these Gemaras on learning and reading about the sacrifices themselves to bring atonement. So here's sort of the basic question that will be our jumping off point in this shir. So why don't we do just that on Pesach? On Yom Kippur, the centerpiece of the davening is the Seder HaAvodah. In Musaf, we recreate and we have piyutim that talk about how on Yom Kippur, when the Beis HaMikdash was standing, the Kohen went into the Kodesh HaKadashim, the Holy of Holies, and he performed this ritual to grant atonement to the Jewish people. We even bow, we do all these things. It's really a highlight of the Yom Kippur service. On Pesach, we don't do anything like that. We tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, but we don't do anything about the Korban Pesach. I could imagine, in theory, a version of the Seder where instead of focusing so much on the Sipor, on the story, we instead talked about the Mishnayos in Pesachim, talking about how the Jewish people would come, be Ola Regel, they would come to Yerushalayim, they would choose a lamb, they would choose a sheep for the Korban Pesach, it would be sacrificed, they would consume it, and all those things. There are a lot of halachos attendant to that. So we could, in theory, talk about that at the Seder. And why, indeed, do we not do that? Now, this is not my own original question. I actually saw this in interesting work by Dr. David Henschke in Israel, a work in Hebrew called Manish Shana Leil HaPesach B'Talmudam Shel Chachamim, like the night of Passover in the works of the sages. And it's a very interesting sort of academic work in general, but one of the central questions that he addresses in this book, and I'm going to share some of what he has to say in this share, but then we're going to branch down to other topics, is this question about why is Pesach reconstructed? Why is the Seder reconstructed so much around the Haggadah, around the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, and not around the halachos or a reconstruction of the sacrifice itself? I mean, yeah. So here I have in source number 5 something called Seder Amiras Korban Pesach, which you will find in some Haggadahs, but it's not like part of the actual night of Pesach. It's something it says to say before Pesach, on Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, the Seder. And it's in Seder of Yaakov Emden from the 17th century. It's also in other sources. And I'll just read to you a little bit to get a flavor of what this is. It says over here in the small text at the beginning, it says, Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayam, when the temple was standing, Haya HaPesach Nishcha B'Yadol B'Nisan, they would sacrifice the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, Achar Tamid Shel Ben Harbayim, after the afternoon sacrifice or the evening sacrifice, V'Achar Kach, V'Alkein, V'Alkein Kadeshi Shalmu Parim Svasenu, in order that, as we saw in the Pasuk in Hosea, the offering of our lips can be like the bowls, Roy L'Chol Hayari V'Chared Al Davar Hashem, everyone who is serious about the word of Hashem, lasok b'seder Korban Pesach achar tefillas mincha, that he should involve himself in reciting this seder of how they brought the Korban Pesach after mincha, shehi neged tamid shaban harbayim ve'hin lecha sidur, and this is the order of it. And then he goes through like a whole. It has another introductory paragraph here. It says like Ribon ha'olamim, Master of the world, atatziv yisaron lahakriv Korban Pesach b'moado. You commanded us to sacrifice the Pesach in its time, ba'arba asar lechodesh rishon, the 14th day of Nisan. And then it says, if after the period on the third line, it says, V'ata b'avonosenu chara beis hamikdash uvata Korban Pesach. But because of our sins, the temple was destroyed. We no longer have a Korban Pesach. Ein lanu lo kohen b'avodasa. We don't have a kohen anymore. Then it says, "V'nishalma farim savasenu," on the another line down, that let this be like the offering of our lips. And it says, "L'cheini hi ratzon." It should be God's will that by saying this, it should be ki'ilu, 4 lines up from the bottom from the bottom of the first paragraph. Ki'ilu karavnu es haPesach moado. It's as if we should have sacrificed the Pesach in its proper time. And then it goes through various. I don't have the whole thing over here, but it goes through various psukim about the Korban Pesach, and then it goes through various halachos about the Korban Pesach. So this is here, but notably, this is not our main avoda on the night of Pesach. This is something maybe that some people say on the afternoon of Pesach. I've never said it. I don't know, maybe some people do say it, but I don't think it's like that commonly said nowadays.
Should it perhaps have been said on Mincha, on Erev Pesach, like the vidui that we say on Purim, on Erev Purim?
You mean on Erev Yom Kippur? Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, so maybe that would be a time to say it. But I haven't seen shuls that do this. Have you?
No, but it's
Yosef, are you aware
Yeah.
of the fact that the whole term Korban Pesach doesn't exist once in the entire Tanakh? And the only time the word Korban is even used in connection with the Pesach is with the Pesach Sheni. They use the term Korban Hashem, but they do not use the term Korban Pesach as such. Isn't there? And you know why? Because the Pesach wasn't intended to bring people close to Hashem. It's basically a backyard Korban, and only later on was it became a Beit HaMikdash Korban. So the term Korban Pesach never caught on until much, much later. And that's, I think, part of the reason why you're not going to see it written around all over the place, because it's not a biblical term.
Okay, fine. Right. I'm not so much talking about the term though, but I am talking about the fact that this at some point did become a central feature, I think.
It's not called the Korban Pesach. It's called the Pesach. Take a look,
Okay.
Search it in the concordance. You'll see the word Ha-Pesach is all over the place, but or V'zavachta Pesach, but the word Korban is never precedes the word Pesach anywhere in the whole Tanakh, because it's not intended to do what every Korban does, which is to bring you to the Mizbeach. Okay, the Parah Aduma is not called the Korban. The Egla Arufa is not called the Korban. The Seir Azazel is not called the Korban. A Korban requires that you come close to from the word Korab.
Okay, that's interesting. All right. I mean, I think nevertheless, this at least to the rabbis, this and in the Mishnah, this is a very central feature of Pesach. And if we do, and I think there is, at least here we see in the Seder Amiras Korban Pesach, that there are those over time who felt that this was something that one might imagine.
Today we do what our ancestors did. We make it into a home Korban. As a practical matter, we're now resuscitating exactly what our ancestors did at the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Essentially, it's a home thing. You even open up the door, but this time it's for Elio. But in other words, it wasn't too hard to excise the Mizbeach part of this, because it never was there in the first place.
Okay, all right.
Rabbi, maybe in the other thing, simple, but in a very simple way. The mitzvah of Pesach is a cheap food,
Mm-hmm.
and because the cheap food, it just Mitzrayim. That's since it was shot. The reason that we
I've lost your whole train of thought now.
don't do, there's no corresponding, let's say, contradictory is mitzvah on Yom Kippur, so we can be free to be talk about the Avodah.
Okay, I mean, I think yes.
Okay,
I
could
think,
we please just listen to you and have everybody ask the questions later? Because I've lost your train of thought completely.
Okay, yes,
Thank you.
I was going to say that, yes. Let's hold questions at least till a stopping point. Probably closer to the middle. We'll do like one round of questions there, and then we'll do another round of questions at the end. But yes, but I mean, I think some of what's going on over here is I'm hearing different things, but I think one thread I'm hearing is maybe the question is not such a good question for various reasons, either because maybe the Pesach was never meant to do what a carbon does, or maybe very simply what Marty is saying, and I am going to talk about this, is that there is a special mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim which doesn't exist by Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur is very different. So yes, I mean I do think, and we're going to talk about this, the Yom Kippur and Pesach are indeed quite different. But I do want to build this up and I want to try to get there. I think at least at the outset, one might have had the intuition or the inclination that there should be some similarity, and we should talk more about the Korban Pesach. We should talk more about the Korban Pesach on this night. But the answer indeed why we don't do that may be obvious, but let's talk a little bit more about the development of this. And what I want to share with you now in the next couple sources are some sources that indicate that maybe, at least among some of Chazal, maybe they thought that indeed the focus of the evening maybe should be different than the focus of the evening as it is today. And maybe the focus of the evening should not be on Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, on telling the story as much. And here I have in source number 6, the Tosefta in Pesachim. And what the Tosefta says over here is Chayav Adam Lasok Behilchos HaPesach Kol Halayla. One should involve themselves in the laws of Pesach all night. Afilu beino levein beno, even if it's just him and his son. Afilu beino levein asmo, even if he's by himself. Afilu beino levein talmido, just between him and his student. And then it says, Ma'aseh Rabban Gamliel Zachenim. There was a story of Rabban Gamliel and the elders. Shahayu Mesubim bebeis Bezos ben Zonim below. They were in this person's house. Vahayu Asukin behelchos haPesach kol halayla. They were discussing the laws of Pesach all night. Ad kros hagever, until the rooster crowed. Higbil milfanem v'noad v'hacholem lebeis medrash. And then the students raised the window covering, and they convened and went to the house of study. So this probably sounds somewhat familiar to you, because this story, in the way it's structured, is kind of similar to the story that we have in the Haggadah. And I have this here in source number 7. Masa Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azai, Rabbi Ki, Rabbi Tarfon. The story about the 5 rabbis. Shahai Mesubim B'nai Brak, they were in B'nai Brak. Bahai Masapim Mitzias Mitzrayim Kol Osa Alai. They were talking about the story of leaving Egypt all that night. Ad Shabo Samei Deim, until their students came. V'amru lahem Rabboseinu, Higias Man Kriya Shema Shel Shachris. That it's time to say the morning Shema. So interesting. We have another story about rabbis at night, but they're doing 2 different things. In the Haggadah, what are they doing? They're telling the story of leaving Egypt. But in the Tosefta, they're not telling the story. They're talking about the halachos of Pesach, presumably the halachos of the sacrifice. So we see that, at least according to one strand in the rabbinic thought, that maybe there was something to this idea that we should be talking about the laws of the sacrifice and not as much about the story of leaving Egypt. As I think I pointed out in a prior class, source number 7, this story in the Haggadah of the rabbis in Bnei Brak does not have any parallel in rabbinic literature. The story is only in the Haggadah. Now, we do see over here in the Tosefta, it does have some kind of parallel, but they're 2 different stories with 2 different emphases. So I think it's interesting that the Haggadah specifically chose the focus to be on the sipur, on the telling, and not like the Tosefta says on the halachos of the Pesach. Another case where we maybe, and we'll talk about why this is maybe not such a good proof, where we see perhaps this rejection of the idea of talking about the laws of Pesach. So we actually let's go down. Actually, let's do this out in a different order. Let's go down to our Haggadah in source number 10, and this is the four sons. So we know this pretty well. We have the four sons: the Chacham, wise son, the Rasha, the wicked son, the Tam, the simple son, She'eni Yodei L'Shol, the one who doesn't know how to ask. So what does the Chacham say? Chacham Mahu Omer, the wise son. What does he say? Ma ha'edus v'achukim ba'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. What are all the laws that Hashem commanded you? Va'af haTorah amor lo k'hilchos haPesach. You tell him the halachos of Pesach. Ein maftir nachar Pesach afikomen, that you can't have an afikomen at some kind of after party after the Korban Pesach. So the wise son is asking on this night about the laws of Pesach. Presumably, again, the laws related to the sacrifice. And you answer him with laws about the sacrifice. You do not tell him the story. However, the source in the Haggadah has two parallels in rabbinic literature. One of them is from the Yerushalmi over here in source number 8. And the Yerushalmi is very interesting because you give a different answer to the wise son. Again, this in the bolded part over here, the Ben Chacham Mahu Omer, what does the wise son ask? What does he say? Ma edus v'achukam mishpatim eshitziva Hashem Elokeinu osana. What are these laws that were commanded? Af ato amorlo, you say to him, b'chozek yad hatzianu Hashem mitzrayim beis avadim. That with a strong hand Hashem took us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. So the way Henschke reads this, and actually some others read it this way as well, some other scholars read it this way as well, is that according to the Yerushalmi, we've rejected the position of the Tosefta that says we should talk about the laws. The wise son may ask you, he says, what are all the laws? And you tell him, no, that's not what tonight is for. Tonight is not for the laws of Pesach. Tonight is for telling the story. So you tell him about how Hashem took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. So it's interesting. If you read the Yerushalmi that way, it seems maybe the Yerushalmi is even rejecting that position. Now, I don't know if this is the right way to read the Yerushalmi. I think there's one very basic problem with this, is that if you look down to the place I underlined in source number 8, it says tipesh mahu omer. The tipesh means stupid, but this is what the Tam, the simple son, is called elsewhere in rabbinic literature. And he says mazos. He asks the same question. What is this? Then you teach him the laws of Pesach. She'en maftir nachar Pesach afikomen. You can't have an afikomen after the Korban Pesach. So that's weird. That's a very strange answer to the simple son. It seems like a detailed answer, very, very specific about different laws. So some suggest that maybe these two answers just got switched. Maybe the Yerushalmi was never meant to be sort of a rejection of the Chacham's position about knowing about the laws, but really you were supposed to give the Chacham the answer about the laws and the simple son the answer about the story, and they just got switched in the Yerushalmi. So I think that's certainly plausible, and then maybe we don't really see any strong rejection of this position in the Yerushalmi, but nevertheless, and I have here in source number 9 the Mechalta, which is an early halachic midrash, and the Mechalta also has the same four sons. Its version is much more similar to our version in the Haggadah about the wise son asking about the laws, being answered about the laws. But anyway, I just brought that here, but I'm not going to go through that. But that's another parallel source to our Haggadah of the four sons. But in any event, in the Haggadah's treatment of the four sons, it's true that the wise son gets answered about the laws. But maybe you could say that's because he knows the story already, and maybe he needs an age-appropriate or a knowledge-appropriate answer, so we are going to teach him something about the laws. But nevertheless, the thrust of the whole passage about the four sons is not about the laws. I mean, we talked about it, the Tam, when the Tam is asked, what is this? He's told that God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. And the She'eni Yodei L'Shol, the one who can't ask at all, it says here in the last line in the first paragraph, Psachlo, you open up for him. Shneimar, as it says, V'gad levincha b'yom lemor, tell your child in that, say, Bavor zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeis mitzrayim. We do all this because Hashem took us out of Egypt. So the focus then in the Haggadah, certainly, if we leave aside the wise son, who maybe we are telling something about the laws, is not on the laws. The focus in the Haggadah, as we said, is very, very clearly about the story, not like the Tosefta says. Indeed, it's really, I think, the answer to the She'enu Yodei L'Shol, the answer to the son who doesn't know how to ask, that becomes sort of the building blocks of how we then open up into going to tell the story. Because right after that, the Haggadah brings the other drasha of Yachal me Rosh Chodesh that I have over here. You might have thought you could already start telling the story on Rosh Chodesh, and it goes through the whole thing saying that it has to be when the Pesach and Marar, Pesach matzah and Marar, or the matzah and Marar are placed in front of you. So you can't do it on the Rosh Chodesh Nisan. You have to do it on the night of the 14th, the night where the Pesach was offered, and the night where we eat the matzah and the Marar. But the point being is that storytelling is a central part, is the central part of the evening. And that's really what the Haggadah is all about. Right, in source number 11, again, I brought for you the same pasuk we've been talking about every time, the pasuk of V'higad to Levincha we just read. And I think really this is also then the answer to the question of why Pesach is different than Yom Kippur and why we don't focus on the avoda. I mean, I think the simplest answer to the question, and Marty really said this before, is that on Yom Kippur we don't have the same idea of telling a story. It's not central to the holiday like it is for Pesach. Yes, there's a Pesach sacrifice, and yes, that was something that was important. But in the absence of the Pesach sacrifice, the focus is certainly going to be on telling the story, because telling the story was always an important part of this holiday. Telling the story was always something that we were supposed to do, and that's the direction the Haggadah goes. Unlike the piece we saw in the Tosefta that might be saying the focus should be on something different, we follow what we follow what we see elsewhere. We follow what we see that the focus should be on telling the story. So that's one possible answer for why we focus on the storytelling, simply because the Psukim, it makes a very big deal about it. Another possibility that Henschke brings up, and I'd like to discuss a little further, is perhaps also part of the focus, and we see this as the Haggadah goes on, part of the focus on telling the story on the night of Pesach is precisely to give us hope for the future. That yes, we no longer have a Korban Pesach. Yes, we no longer can do the sacrificial rite in the temple, but God redeemed us from Egypt. And if God redeemed us from Egypt, then surely God can redeem us again from our current exile, and we will get back to a place where we can do the Pesach sacrifice again. And by telling the story, by focusing on the liberation that God wrought for us long ago, it actually draws focus toward the fact that someday we will be returned to a state where we can bring the Pesach again. And again, how much weight you want to give to some historical perspective, I don't know. But I think as like a sort of a nice sort of thematic, I think it has thematic resonance regardless in the Seder. And so for what I'd like to do now in part 2 of the class is talk about this idea of Mashiach and Geula and what role those things play at the Seder. Because as I'm going to show, they do play a fairly significant role. And possibly that part of the reason why this is the case is that it actually brings the Korban Pesach back to the center. It sort of was sidelined, but at the same time, by thinking and hoping and yearning for the Mashiach, it brings it back to us to some degree. Let's look briefly at the chat. Okay. So Ariel asked what the manuscript evidence indicates about the switch and the Yerushalmi of the. I'm pretty sure actually, if I remember correctly, the manuscript evidence doesn't provide any evidence that there was a switch, which is why some scholars are very cautious about saying that the two answers were switched. Because it's one thing to say there was a switch if we have a manuscript that says that the answers to the Chacham and the Tam were switched. But in the absence of manuscript, you might not want to make that, you might not want to say that. I think what's just interesting is that in the Mechilta and the Haggadah, it is reversed. So that might be our evidence. If it's really all working off the same text, then maybe that'll be our evidence there was some switch that took place. But again, I think we don't really know. Okay, so let's talk now about what we see about the final redemption in the Haggadah. And this, I think the first place and the most basic place where we see this focus is in source number 12, which is the Mishnah Pesachim. As we talked about how the Mishnah Pesachim goes through the order of Magid, talks about Manishtana, and it talks about telling the darshaning the psukim of Arami Ovid Avi, and then it talks about Lefichach Therefore, we are obligated to praise Hashem. It goes into the first two paragraphs of Hallel. And then, v'chosem begeula, as we see in source number 12, that we say a bracha of Asher Galanu, about how God redeemed us from Egypt, and that is the end of Magid. We conclude with that formula. But there's a machlokas among the Tanai about how you do this. Rabbi Tarfon says, what do we say? Asher Galanu v'galas avasim mitzrayim lo haya chosem. That the bracha is just, blessed is God who redeemed us from Egypt, but there is no conclusion beyond that. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kain Hashem, Elokeinu, Elokei Avosenu, Yageinu, Lemoadim, V'lir Galim Achrim, Haboim Lekresenu Shalom. That we say that God should bring us to other festivals and times. We will be rejoiced in the rebuilding of the city and in the service, in the temple. And then we'll eat again from the various sacrifices and from the Pesach sacrifice, Ad Baruch Ata Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, until blessed are you who redeemed Israel. So Bekiya very clearly says, Rabbi Tarfon is saying that the focus is just on the past, that God did redeem us from Egypt in the past. Rabbi Akiva says, no, that's not the focus of this night only. The focus is also on the future. That yes, we talk about God's liberation of us from Egypt, but that's in part because God can do this again. And that we hope that Hashem will bring us to a time where the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt and we can bring the Pesach again. So we see, and this is indeed what we do in our Haggadah. This is what we have in our Magid. We follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva here. And so we see that far from being sidelined, actually our hope in a future redemption, we can come back and bring the Korban Pesach, is front and center. We may not talk about it so much in the evening, and we focus very much on the story, and indeed storytelling is the primary obligation of the night, but at the same time we have not forgotten about the fact that we hope to bring the Pesach again someday in Messianic times when God redeems us again, just like he redeemed us the first time from Egypt. Okay, so I want to talk about a few other places on the Haggadah where we see this focus on the redemption. And what I'd like to argue, and I argued as much in an article I published in Lehrhouse a couple of years ago, which you can look up, that actually the Haggadah is bookended by pleas for redemption in Halach Ma'anya at the front and in Chasal Seder Pesach at the end, at least the way the Haggadah is structured now. One thing I never did, I realize now, is I did not share the link to the source sheet in the chat. I tend to be remiss about doing that, but let me do that this time, at least so people have it. If they want to look on that way. I should have done it at the beginning, but I forgot. Okay, that's the link to the source sheet. So let's talk about Halach Ma'anya. So here we have in source number 13, Halach Ma'anya. This is how we start off Magid. And we say Halach Ma'anya, De'achalo avasana ba'ard mitzrayim. This is the bread of poverty. Ancestors lay in the land of Egypt. Kol dechvin yeseh v'yechol. And anyone who's hungry, come and eat. Kol detzrich yeseh v'yisach. And anyone who wants, come and make Pesach. Hashata hacha. Now we are here. The Shana haba ba'ard Yisrael. Next year we may be in the land of Israel. Hashata avdei. This year we are slaves. The Shana haba b'nei chorin. So you see, this plea for redemption is actually at the forefront, at the very beginning of the Seder. Let's go a little deeper into this, though. Because where did Halach Ma'anya come from? I promise in this class a lot of this is going to be about the historical development of the Haggadah. We're going to talk about as many parts of the Haggadah as we can and talk about how they came to be. So I want to focus a little bit now on Halach Ma'anya and how that came to be. I think the questions on Halach Ma'anya are many. Many of you are familiar with these questions. Why is it in Aramaic when the rest of the Haggadah is not in Aramaic and it's in Hebrew? Why are we inviting guests to the Seder when it's already begun? Why are we talking about the matzah as plain poor bread if elsewhere in the Haggadah the matzah is called the bread of redemption? Why are we talking about us remaining in exile and being unredeemed at this stage of the Haggadah? So we're not. Let's think about historically how this perhaps came to be. And I think what most scholars think now is that this is definitely a Gaonic text. This is not a text from the Mishnah. This is not a text from the Gemara. This is something that came into the Haggadah in the period of the Gaonim, when we talked about as many of the paragraphs of the Haggadah came to full form in the period of the Gaonim. It may be in Aramaic because the Gaonim living in Babylonia did sometimes write in Aramaic. Now, it tended to be when they wrote liturgical texts, they were in Hebrew and not in Aramaic, but we do apparently have some small counterexamples of this. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, there are parts of Slichos, which are also Gaonic. that we say that do have some Aramaic components. So it could be in line with that we do have some Aramaic components in Tefillos written by the Gaonim. Scholars also say that indeed it does seem like this paragraph was meant as an invitation to the poor to come and join the Seder. We see, for example, in the Gemara in Tanis, in source number 14, a similar type of invitation. It was talking about Rav Huna, ki have krach rifta, when he would eat bread, have a pasach lababa, he would open the doors of his house, but Amran, he would say, koman detzrich leisei v'leichol. Everyone who needs, let him come in and eat. And it seems like we're paralleling this in this invitation in the Haggadah. What I think is particularly interesting, though, is in source number 15 about the origins of the custom of saying halach ma'anya. We have evidence from the time of the Gaonim about what was going on over here from a Rav Matisya. And we have over here Kasav, Rav Matisya. Rav Matisya writes, Ma shenagu lomer kol dechvin yesei v'yechol, that which we say halach ma'anya, whoever is hungry, come and eat. Kach haya minag avos. This was the custom of our fathers. They would raise the tables up. They would not close their doors. And they would say this that they wanted to invite their poor Jewish neighbors and receive reward for inviting the poor to the Seder. And he says, "Va'achshav shenas shchene akum yosem shchene Yisrael." Now there's just a lot of non-Jewish neighbors, and the Jewish neighbors might not be going out of their house on Seder night. We arrange for their parnas, we arrange for their sustenance ahead of time. Meaning, if we're going to invite guests to the Seder, we don't do it on the spot anymore when the Seder starts. We do it, in advance. So therefore, the poor people wouldn't have to go knocking on doors at night. But nonetheless, after that, in memory of this, we still raise the table and we still say, like we used to say, anyone should come and eat. Meaning, although the guests have already been invited, and the declaration has no actual effect right now, because the guests are already there, we are keeping the custom of our fathers in its place and talking about this invitation, even though it's already happened. So that may very well be why halach ma'anya developed, that it originally started off as an invitation to the poor, and then it became a zecher, or a remembrance of that invitation to the poor, but we still say it. So I think we've so far dealt with some of the questions about why is it in Aramaic, because the Gaonim signs were in Aramaic. Why are we inviting the guests? Well, we're not really inviting the guests. They were already invited before, but we're remembering a time when the guests might have been invited right then at the Seder. We haven't really talked about the part about why we're talking here about the Geula. But I think that there are some interesting ways to approach this. I had a suggestion, which I said in my article from a couple of years ago, which is kind of based on the Abarbanel, and I think I must have seen it more fully elsewhere as well. That maybe halach ma'anya, in addition to being sort of this remembrance of the invitation that we gave to the guests, is kind of a reality check before we begin the Seder. Because we're not exactly where we're supposed to be. We say basically, look, here's this poor bread. Here's this poor bread that we ate in Egypt, because all we have is this poor bread. All we have is the matzah. What are we missing? We're missing the sacrificial meat. We're missing the Pesach. And then we say, Kol dechmin yesei v'yechol. Anyone who's hungry can come and eat. Kol ditzrich yesei v'yifsach. And we use the word v'yifsach. Yetei v'yifsach. Come make Pesach. And maybe this is almost like a sarcastic, ironic way of saying this. That, yeah, right now, anyone can come and join us and be Yifsach, but there is no Korban Pesach. We have no Pesach, and so you can join us, even though we're lacking that. Because it used to be, in the time of the Korban Pesach, people would have to be appointed. The Mishnah talks about how people have to be appointed to a group to eat the Korban Pesach ahead of time. You couldn't just join a group on the night of Pesach if you hadn't had one set up before. But tonight, we don't have a Pesach anymore, so anyone can come. And then once we've set up that reality that we're lacking the Korban Pesach, and it's not the way it used to be, we say, yeah, Hashata Hacha, we're only here, the Shana Haba Ba'ard Yisrael, but next year may we be free. So at least according to this maybe somewhat homiletic, but also I think very true reading of Halach Ma'anya. It's a reality check before we begin the Seder, saying, look how this Seder is not complete, is not the way it should be. We are indeed lacking the Korban Pesach, and we're lacking the Korban Pesach because we are unredeemed, because we're living in exile. So next year, may we be in the land of Israel. What's also interesting, and I think this is also a component of this too, Rav Matisya, we saw, talks about not locking the doors, not closing the doors, leaving the doors open and inviting people. And we don't do that anymore at the beginning of the Seder, but we do it still at the end of the Seder, and we do it to invite Eliyahu. And if you look over here in source number 16 from the Maser Rokeach, which is a 13th century source, but he is citing Rav Nisim Gaon from the 11th century. And he says in source number 16, Masasi Megillah Starim, I found in Megillah Starim, which is a work written by Rav Nisim Gaon, Ra'isi Mirabana Aluf Abba Lo Hayasoga Dalse Abayis, Asher Ana Yoshim Beklal. He would not close the doors of the house at all, not even till now. And this is our custom. The doors of the house remain open. Keshiyava Eliyahu, when Elijah comes, Netzi lekrasov mehera below Ikav will go out and greet him quickly without any delay. V'amrinam bepesach hasiyin ligal, as we know it's said that Pesach is a time when we will be redeemed in the future too. Shenamar, as it says, Leil Shimurim Hu Hashem. This is a night of watching for Hashem. And that's elsewhere darshan to mean that darshan show that Pesach is a time of redemption. Pesach is a night of vigil. Pesach is a night of watching. It's also a night of watching for the redemption. It's a time when we expect that maybe someday we will be redeemed. So we see how this idea that originally of leaving the doors open for the guests becomes leaving the doors open for Elijah to herald in the Messianic era. And now we don't do this during the entire Seder, but we do it at the end of the Seder. In the Middle Ages, after the persecutions of the Crusades, when things were really bad for the Jews in Europe, we started saying the verses of Shvach Hamaska, that Hashem should pour out his wrath on the nations. And that's the time we open the door. And then we would invite, that was also to invite Eliyahu in though. And now we have a kosher Eliyahu as well. No one's exactly sure of the origin of the kosher Eliyahu, why we have a cup for Elijah. I mean, it could be that it has to do with debates over whether there should be a fifth cup, because there are some opinions that there should be not 4 cups at the Seder, but 5 cups. And if that's the case, we don't know there's supposed to be a 5th cup. There's this idea that Eliyahu might resolve halachic questions in the future, so we leave out the 5th cup for Eliyahu to resolve. Or it could be that it was a cup that was put on the table to pour wine back that you didn't finish into it, kind of like a discard cup. But in any way, whatever the origin exactly was of this cup, it's very clear, and there are sources that say this fairly early as well in the Middle Ages, that it becomes associated with the redemption of Eliyahu, that Eliyahu is this herald of redemption. So we see how this paragraph of Halach Ma'anya, with the opening of the doors and inviting guests, kind of morphs over time into something that's really all about, or can be read in part about, redemption. That we ask in this paragraph for redemption. And I mean, indeed, I think also once Halach Ma'anya, let me say this a little more clearly, actually. So if we say that Halach Ma'anya was originally about opening the door and inviting guests, but it does have a component in there, as we said in the text, where we're also saying that we should be redeemed. Next, we may be in the land of Israel. So it's not so crazy to assume, it's not so crazy to assume that maybe once once already in Halach Ma'anya we have something about redemption, that the opening of the door then becomes associated with the final redemption, with the coming of Eliyahu. So we do see over here how that the redemption does remain front and center, even at the beginning of the Seder with Halach Ma'anya, and at the end of the Seder with the opening of the door for Eliyahu. And that's how we kind of get back to the state where we would be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Okay, so we've discussed Halach Ma'anya, and that's at the beginning of the Seder. And then we discussed opening the door for Eliyahu at the end of the Seder, or in both places we're seeing something about redemption. Last, I'd like to discuss an interesting paragraph we have at the end of our Haggadah, Chasal Seder Pesach, because here we also see elements of the redemption. So in our Haggadah, I have here in source number 17, we say this paragraph after we drink the 4th cup of wine. Chasal Seder Pesach ke'oskaso ke'chol mishpacho v'chukaso. We've completed the Seder of Pesach according to its law. Kasher Zachin Lasadero. So just like we've done it tonight, Kachnis Kalaso, so too in the Messianic times should we be able to do it. Zach Shochein Me'ona, Komem Kahaladas Mimana, Bekarv Nehel Netechana, Petuim Litzian Barina. Pure one who dwells in heaven, raise up the congregation too numerous to count. Soonly the firm salvings redeemed to Zion in song. And then we add to that, Lishana Habab Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, or some people say, Lishana Habab Yerushalayim Habenuyah, next year in the rebuild. Jerusalem. So we see again over here, he said, Halach Ma'anya, we have at the beginning of the Seder, talking about how we hope for redemption. Chasal Seder Pesach, we have at the end of the Seder, how about we hope for redemption, with the addition of Lashana Haba. But the question is, where did this paragraph come from? Where did Chazal Seder Pesach come from at all? So actually, what's particularly interesting over here was this was not part of the Haggadah originally, and this does not come from the Haggadah at all. This is actually the end of a very long piyut by Rav Yosef Tov Elam. And I have over here part of it in source number 18. This is the Yoser for Shabbos Haggadah. So on special Shabbos throughout the year, as many of you may already know, we have like we're in this cycle right now actually, the Arba Parshios, the 4 Parshios. We start with Shkalim, and then Zachor, and then Para and Achodesh, and then we add Shabbos Haggadah, which is the Shabbos right before Pesach. And there were special piyutim that were composed, mostly in the Middle Ages, to be said on those Shabboses. Now, many shuls do not say these piyutim anymore, but some shuls still do say them. So one of the ones, and you'll find this in the Art School Seder still, the Yotzer for Shabbos Haggadah, this piyut that you say, that the Chazan says during the repetition of Shmona Esrei for Shabbos Haggadah in Musaf, does contain these words. It's actually a very long poem about all the laws of Pesach, actually, and about all the things that you do on Pesach. And I just give you a small excerpt over here in source number 18. But it starts with like, let's see. If you look at the second bolded piece that says at the end of the first line, and we're saying God of spirits of mankind, Chok Lama Masar, he gave law to his people, Musar, and he admonished them with that law. And it says, "Livto chametz or al they should check for chametz on the night of the 14th. B'shah she'em b'nei adam mitzuyim b'shuka, when people are no longer in the marketplace, and it goes through various laws of Bigadigas Chametz. And then I have a little portion where it talks about some of the laws of the Seder. After the ellipsis, I point at the end of the third line. Umozgin lo keishani Sheni Merba Sa'el, then you pour the second out of 4 cups. V'chan haben Shoel, v'chan haben me'aviv Shoel, and the son asked his father, Manishtana melelo zelel, why is this night different from other nights? V'gomer ha'agada agal Yisrael, you finish the Haggadah until Gal Yisrael. Then it talks about the third cup. And then after talking about all the laws of the Seder, if you see bolded on the second to last line, it says, Chasal Seder Pesach Tel Chaso. Now we've completed going through all the laws of the Seder. According to all its laws. Kasher Zachin Lasader so, just like we have merited to lay it all down for you, Kanis Kelaso so should we merit to do it next week. Meaning after Shabbos Haggadah, when we actually get to the Pesach Seder, we just talked about all the laws, and then we're going to do it. We're going to do this Seder next week. And then we have the conclusion over there, and then it says V'chein lachasa kedusha ki aka kadosh Yisrael Moshiach, and then we go right into kedusha. That's in the place of repetition of Shemona Esrei where this is said. We go right into kedusha afterwards. So we see what happened over here. It's really very interesting. We have this piyut, which is a long description of the laws of the Seder, and then at the end the piyut closes with, we've just gone through the whole Seder. Next week at the Seder, may we merit to do it. And then when it goes to the Haggadah, and this happens, I think in like the 15th, I think it's the 15th century or so, when this starts making it into the Haggadah, and we've changed the meaning. It's no longer about the laws of Pesach and how we're going to fulfill the Seder next week. We're at the Seder. When we say Kasher Zachin L'Sader Oso, Kenis Kela So, what we're saying is just like we've completed the Pesach Seder, next year we merit to do it in Jerusalem. And so this piyut, which was about doing the Seder in Galus, in exile, now becomes a prayer. It's transformed into a prayer for redemption and how we've completed the Seder here in exile, but next year may we do it in the rebuilt Jerusalem. So it's really very interesting how this kind of takes on a whole new meaning when it's added to the Haggadah. But I think that part of the reason why this gets added to the Haggadah really makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're bookending now the Seder with prayers for redemption. At the very beginning in Halach Ma'anya, in the Gaonic times, we start asking for redemption, and now at the end in Chasal Seder Pesach, we've repurposed the piyut to also pray for redemption. And then to add to that, we say Lashana Haba. So what's interesting about Lashana Haba next year in Jerusalem, this is actually a separate prayer, which is not connected per se to Chasal Seder Pesach. And this actually dates back a very long time. This was certainly already said at Sedarim on Pesach night by 1300. Because if you see over here in source number 19, in the Bird's Head Haggadah, this actually has it. If you look over here, it has a piece over here of Adir Bimlucha, which we'll talk about next week. That's one of the songs we sing in Nirtza now, after the Seder. But then it has Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, next to in Jerusalem. And then it has the bracha of Borei Pri Gafen on the fourth cup of wine. So the placement is a little different. We'll talk a little more about how Nirtza is ordered next week. But the point is, Lashana Haba is very old. It dates back at least to 1300. People were saying at the Seder, if not before. You see over here the people with the birds' heads on the left-hand side. They're pointing their fingers up to a heavenly Jerusalem or something. So that they are indeed yearning here for the redemption. So even without Chasal Seder Pesach, we see though that like already at the end of the Seder, people were closing with Lashana Haba. When did this start? We don't really know. Where's the other place where we do this? We do this one other time of year, and that's on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur also we say Lashana Haba, and no one really knows how it developed there either. We don't actually see it in Sidurim for Yom Kippur until like 1700, 1800 apparently, but presumably this is something that happened long before. I think it's the type of thing that at a moment of peak religious drama, when we've just done something very significant and very important, such as Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, or such as Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, or the Pesach Seder, that we almost burst out spontaneously and we say, next year may we be in Jerusalem. We do this other times too. Not exactly in the same way, but like oftentimes, some rabbi is speaking or something like that, and he talks about he ends, with about the rebuild Beis Hamikdash, and then he says Shiyabana that it should be built Meher V'Yameinu Amen, speedily in our day, Amen. It's kind of just something that just spontaneously happens. It's even like in the Mishnah. I was just learning the Mishnah at the end of Tanis, Maseches Tanis with my son, and I was just struck by the fact that the Mishnah ends that way. It talks about the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, and then it says Shiyabanu Meher Yameinu Amen, that it should be rebuilt speedily in our time, because this is just something as Jews that we yearn for constantly. And in those moments, when we feel, in a way, the absence of the Beis Hamikdash the most, and I do think one of those times might be at the end of the Pesach Seder, we say Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim. So it's sort of almost a spontaneous ritual that developed. It's a spontaneous ritual that developed and made its way then formally into the Haggadah. As you see over here in source number 20 of Yitzchak Turnow in the 15th century from the Sefer HaMenhagim, he talks about the whole thing already by then being connected together. He talks about how we have Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim and Chasal Seder Pesach already together in the Haggadah. So it seems like they had already come together at that point. But the idea being is that certainly by then we've developed rituals that at the close of the Seder, we remember Jerusalem and we pine for a rebuilt Jerusalem, both through Chasal Seder Pesach and the line of Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim. And I think I wanted to add sort of like an interesting story about this. I do think it's really very fitting that you might imagine this as something that just came into being spontaneously. There wasn't like a specific directive to add Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim, but it just sort of happened. And it was actually in shul this past Yom Kippur. I'm hearing some feedback here. I'm going to try to mute. I think when I'm sharing the screen, I can't find the mute button. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to mute. Okay. All right. So I've set up the mute again. All right. So at the end of Yom Kippur, we said Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim in shul. We also said Am Yisrael Chai. And it doesn't say that in the Machzor anymore. You should say Am Yisrael Chai. I think it was just sort of something that people felt appropriate in that moment, especially after the year that we had, that very difficult year. Maybe other shuls did this too. I just thought it was very interesting, and to me it was very moving. that we're reaffirming our commitment to Jewish existence and Jewish eternity. And just like L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, I think, may have developed spontaneously, that spontaneous saying that we did of Am Yisrael Chai, maybe, I don't know, maybe someday that will become part of Yom Kippur too. I don't know. But it's interesting kind of how these things developed. But the main point I'm trying to make over here is that both at the beginning and the end of the Seder, we keep our focus indeed on the redemption and on a time when we may go back to Jerusalem and be able to bring the Korban Pesach again. And that can again be the central focus of our evening, not to diminish the importance of telling the story, but the Haggadah never forgets the fact that we are indeed in exile and we don't have everything that we should, and we no longer have a Korban Pesach. Okay, so I'm finished over here, and the next and final class we'll talk about more about the songs at the end of the Seder in Nirza, and that will be including a family favorite of Chad Gadya, so stay tuned for that next week. Until then, let me look at anything in the chat and answer any additional questions.
Thank you.
So Chaim Kranzler says, give the source of your article and Dr. David Henschke's article. So, all right, let me just see if I can get this in the chat quickly. Yeah, here's the link to my article I just put in the chat. As far as Dr. Henschke's book, it's a book, it's not an article, but I can share a link to the book as well. It's not a book that's easily obtainable though. Okay, are there any further questions as well?
Thank
I'm
you.
muted. Okay, I just want to tell you that Rabbi Sobolovsky told me many years ago already that at the end of the Pesach Seder, he stays up all night learning
Okay.
laws. So, obviously, yeah, but I think also the reason that we can't focus on the laws is because we have to tell our children, Levinchen, before you get to a point where you can do what Rabbi Sobolovsky is doing, maybe with his children or with other people, is that they have to have that Jewish identity and feel connected and experience what we're supposed to experience. We're there, not on such an intellectual, the laws, as much as feeling it so they can get to the point, for all of us even, to grow to the point where we're doing what you talked about, why we aren't studying the laws so much in the Haggadah. I think it's got to be more about experience that first and feel like we're in it, and get our children to feel like they're in it. I remember when my kids were little, and when they grew up, and I have grandchildren, they couldn't get over, because didn't remember. Well, they did remember, but I started focusing the whole Seder on my grandchildren with Jell-O that was the blood, and the marshmallows that they could put the bowl, and they would make their faces with beards, would do it in preparation before, so they could play out the part, of being, Moshe or in the baby or whatever. So I think that's an important part of all this. When you get to Yom Kippur, you're davening. It does mean different things to different people. Like when I talked to my granddaughter that I thought wasn't davening enough on Yom Kippur next to me, she said, Safti, everything's a journey. I got to get there. 'Cause it didn't mean enough to her. So I think that's a very big part of this that we have to recognize.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I'll say Rabbi Sobolovsky was actually my first Rebbe at YU. When I was there, my first year I was in his shir. And also, yeah, but I think a lot of what we've seen really fits with that, because for the vast majority of people, I think the Haggadah is saying, just like it answers the Tam and the Shenu de L'Shol, that it's about telling the story, because that's the avoda of the night. That's what we've got to do. That's the foundation that we have to lay. Yes, for the wise son, maybe tell him about the laws, because he's on that level. And then maybe for us today, we can still talk about the laws of Pesach, but we're going to do it after the Seder. I'm not going to stay up all night, but Rabbi Sobolovsky certainly is on the level to do that.
It's interesting.
Don't feel, and I've known this for years. We fall right to sleep. I'm sorry.
Hmm.
So don't, yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just it's interesting that it seems the majority of people go to sleep after the Haggadah and don't stay up all night, even though this may be a higher level obligation in theory than the Tikkun Leil Shavua, which is much later.
Hmm. Yes, right. That's true. Yeah. Oh, there's some discussion in the chat over here about the kosher Eliyahu, about collecting the wine. Yeah, so I think I didn't want to get so into this. Maybe I shouldn't have brought up it all so much because I haven't researched it fully. I don't know the halachic ins and outs of the concept of yayin pagum very much, but I do think that those who suggest that the wine was being collected in a central cup, I think it was an issue of this halachic concern about yayin pagum, that once you poured wine out of a bottle, there's an issue with like perhaps leaving it in the cup and pouring additional wine into the cup. So there's something about pouring the wine back into the bottle. But again, I'm not really holding in that halachic issue to discuss it well enough. But I think that some suggest the kosher Eliyahu had something to do with that originally. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. If there are no further questions, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much. Appreciated.
You're welcome.
Shabbat Shalom, I say now, even though it's
That was
Monday.
great.
Or maybe I'll see people tomorrow on another one.
I think Torah in Motion is doing a lot of Pesach related classes this week and next week.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Wait, how do I get off?